My name is Alice Newberry, and I'm 33 years old. People look at my life today and assume everything came easily. They see my name on the glass door of a prestigious financial firm, the tailored suits, the confident smile, and the comfortable apartment overlooking the Chicago skyline. They see success. What they don't see is the 18-year-old girl who learned in a single conversation that her parents believed she was worth less than her younger brother. That lesson shaped every decision I've made since. I grew up in a perfectly ordinary middle-class family. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable enough that my parents proudly told everyone they had started college funds for both of their children. Ever since I could remember, they reminded me that education was the key to my future. Every birthday, every Christmas, every report card came with another speech about making smart decisions because my college fund represented years of sacrifice. I believed them. I carefully saved birthday money instead of spending it. I bought secondhand clothes without complaining. Whenever I wanted something expensive, my mother would smile and say, "Think about your future, Alice." Meanwhile, my younger brother, Ethan, lived in a completely different world. If Ethan wanted the newest laptop, somehow he got it. If he wanted private violin lessons, my parents found the money. If he wanted to attend another academic summer program, they called it an investment. Nobody ever questioned the cost when it came to Ethan, because Ethan had potential. That word echoed through our house like a family motto. I wasn't a bad student. I earned solid grades, played softball, volunteered on weekends, and stayed out of trouble. Teachers liked me because I worked hard. Friends trusted me because I kept my promises. But whenever someone praised me, my parents responded politely before immediately steering the conversation back toward Ethan. "Alice got another A." "That's wonderful. Did we tell you Ethan qualified for the national science competition?" It happened so often that eventually I stopped expecting anything different. By 16, the contrast was impossible to ignore. For my birthday, my parents gave me a $50 bookstore gift card and a handwritten card signed in blue ink. 3 months later, Ethan turned 16. They rented a banquet room at our favorite Italian restaurant. More than 40 guests attended. There was a custom cake, live music, expensive decorations, and at the end of the night, my parents surprised him with a brand new MacBook. When I quietly asked why our birthdays had been so different, my mother barely looked up from cleaning wrapping paper. "Ethan is going places," she said. "We have to encourage his dreams." I remember standing there holding a trash bag, wondering why my dreams apparently cost so much less. Senior year arrived quickly. I applied to several respected state universities with excellent business programs. Nothing flashy. I simply wanted a degree, a career, and a life I could build myself. When I received my acceptance letter to my first choice university, I practically ran into the kitchen. "I got in!" My father smiled without looking away from the newspaper. "That's good." Then he asked Ethan whether Princeton had replied to his scholarship application. My excitement disappeared almost instantly. Still, I refused to let their indifference steal my happiness. I would make something of myself anyway, or at least that was what I believed. A week before I left for college, my parents asked me to sit down in the living room. Something felt wrong immediately. My father avoided eye contact. My mother's hands stayed folded tightly in her lap. "Alice," Dad began carefully, "we need to discuss your college fund." I assumed the financial crisis had hurt their savings. I was already preparing myself to hear there would be less money than expected. Instead, my mother quietly said, "We've decided to transfer most of your college fund to Ethan." For several seconds, I honestly thought I had misunderstood her. "I'm sorry, what?" "Ethan was accepted into Columbia," Dad explained. "Even with scholarships, it's expensive." I stared at him. "So you're giving him my college fund?" "We're reallocating resources," Mom corrected gently. The fund you've spent my entire childhood telling me belonged to me? Dad leaned forward. Your university is affordable. Student loans and part-time work will cover the difference. Ethan has extraordinary opportunities ahead of him. And I don't? Neither of them answered immediately. Finally, my mother sighed. Alice, you're practical. Practical. Such a harmless word. Except in that moment it meant ordinary, replaceable, less deserving. You'll be fine, Dad continued. You've always figured things out. I looked back and forth between them, desperately hoping someone would laugh and admit this was a terrible joke. Nobody did. So everything you've told me since I was 5 years old was a lie? No, Mom insisted. Circumstances changed. No, I whispered. You changed. Dad explained that they would leave $5,000 in my account, just in case. The remaining $35,000 would pay for Ethan's education. Our investment will have a greater return, he said confidently. Investment, return, potential. Every word felt colder than the last. I packed for college mostly in silence. The week I moved into my dorm, I realized exactly what $35,000 looked like. It looked like student loans. It looked like 2 part-time jobs. It looked like skipped meals, used textbooks, and sleeping 4 hours a night. Within months, the emergency money had disappeared into tuition, housing, books, meal plans, and mandatory fees. By my second semester, I was working 25 hours each week at a grocery store while carrying a full academic schedule. My days started before sunrise and often ended after midnight. Sometimes I'd fall asleep wearing my work uniform because I was too exhausted to change clothes. Whenever I called home, my parents spent 5 minutes asking about me, then 30 minutes talking about Ethan. Ethan had made Dean's List. Ethan had joined an elite research project. Ethan was spending spring break in Europe for an academic conference. Every conversation reminded me exactly where I ranked in my own family. One evening during sophomore year, completely overwhelmed by work, classes, and growing student debt, I finally called my parents and asked if they could help me with just a few $100s each month. Not forever, just enough to reduce my work hours and keep my grades from slipping. My mother actually laughed. Oh, sweetheart, we can't. We're already helping Ethan with so many expenses. I closed my eyes. The expenses you're paying with my college fund? Silence. Then she answered quietly. We did what was best for the family. I hung up before she could say anything else. That night, standing alone outside my apartment after another late shift, I made myself a promise. If I ever succeeded, it would never be because someone believed in my potential. It would be because I refused to let their choice define my future. The hardest part of college wasn't the classes. It wasn't the endless exams, the impossible deadlines, or even working 25 hours every week while carrying a full course load. The hardest part was realizing that nobody was coming to save me. While Ethan enjoyed internships my parents proudly financed and attended networking events in New York, I counted every dollar before buying groceries. I became an expert at stretching one rotisserie chicken across an entire week. Rice, pasta, frozen vegetables, and instant noodles filled my kitchen cupboards because they were cheap enough to fit inside my tiny budget. My classmates spent weekends relaxing. I spent mine stocking shelves at the grocery store. Sometimes customers would complain because the line moved too slowly, never realizing the exhausted cashier standing in front of them had already attended 4 lectures that day and still had 3 chapters to study before sunrise. There were nights I cried quietly in my car before driving home, not because I wanted sympathy, because I was simply too tired to feel anything else. Ironically, those years became the making of me. I learned how to organize every minute of my day. I learned discipline. I learned resilience. Most importantly, I learned that depending on other people was dangerous. During my senior year, everything seemed to collapse at once. I was taking 18 credit hours, working nearly 30 hours every week, interviewing for jobs, trying desperately to graduate with honors despite the constant exhaustion. Then, during finals week, I caught the worst stomach virus I'd ever experienced. I could barely stand without feeling dizzy. Missing work wasn't an option. Missing exams wasn't an option. So I swallowed medication, forced myself through every final, and worked every scheduled shift while wondering whether I'd pass out in the middle of the store. Desperate, I called my mother. For just a moment, I wanted to hear something comforting. Anything. Instead, she interrupted me halfway through explaining how sick I was. "Drink more water," she said. "You'll recover." Then she excitedly spent almost 20 minutes describing the graduation celebration she and Dad were organizing for Ethan. They had rented an elegant venue, hired caterers, invited more than 100 guests. The party alone would cost nearly $8,000. I looked around my tiny apartment. The electricity bill sat unpaid on the kitchen counter. I hadn't bought new shoes in almost 3 years. I thanked her for the advice, then quietly ended the call. I graduated 4 years later with a finance degree and nearly $80,000 in student loan debt. Graduation day should have been one of the happiest moments of my life. Instead, I walked across the stage alone. My roommate's parents cheered louder for me than my own family ever had. My parents never came. Why? Because they were in New York, attending another celebration for Ethan's graduation from Columbia. Apparently, my ceremony conflicted with the weekend brunch they'd organized after his graduation festivities. Weeks earlier, when I'd reminded them about my graduation date, Mom simply sighed. "Oh, sweetheart, that's unfortunate." Unfortunate. She said it as casually as discussing the weather. A few days later, a greeting card arrived in the mail. Inside was a $100 check. "Congratulations. Love, Mom and Dad." No handwritten message. No apology. Nothing. Meanwhile, Facebook overflowed with dozens of photos celebrating Ethan. Pictures in his graduation gown. Pictures at expensive restaurants. Pictures with proud parents standing on either side of him. My own graduation wasn't even mentioned. I packed my belongings alone, accepted an accounting position in Chicago, and quietly left home without expecting anyone to notice. Chicago wasn't glamorous. My first apartment measured barely 400 square feet. The radiator rattled every winter night. The upstairs neighbor practiced drums after midnight. The neighborhood wasn't exactly safe, but it was all I could afford. My starting salary sounded impressive until taxes, rent, insurance, transportation, groceries, and my student loan payments swallowed nearly all of it. Every month I paid $1,200 toward loans that should never have existed. Every payment reminded me exactly what my parents had taken from me. Still, I never missed one. The work itself was exhausting. Tax season regularly meant 70-hour weeks. Most new employees complained. I volunteered for extra assignments. If someone needed help finishing reports, I stayed. If clients demanded impossible deadlines, I accepted them. My supervisors noticed. Slowly, very slowly, doors began opening. Around that time, I met Daniel Price. Unlike everyone else in my life, Daniel never asked what family I came from or whether my parents were proud of me. He cared about what I wanted. On our third date, I apologized because I couldn't afford an expensive restaurant. He smiled, bought hot dogs from a street vendor, and said, "I'd rather eat here with someone honest than somewhere fancy with someone pretending." I laughed harder than I had in months. Daniel became the first person who celebrated my victories without comparing them to someone else's. When I finally paid off the last dollar of my student loans at 28, he surprised me with a homemade cake. No expensive decorations, No speeches. Just chocolate frosting with 3 words written across the top. You did it. I cried harder over that little cake than I had during my entire graduation. My parents barely reacted. Dad simply said, "See, we knew you'd figure it out." Not congratulations, not "we're proud of you," just proof, in his mind, that they had been right all along. At 29, I joined a larger financial firm. At 31, I became senior accountant. At 32, manager. Then, 2 months before my 33rd birthday, the managing partners invited me into the boardroom. I honestly thought I'd made a mistake on a major client account. Instead, the senior partner smiled. "Alice, we'd like to welcome you as our newest partner." For several seconds, I couldn't breathe. Everything I'd sacrificed, every late night, every skipped vacation, every humiliating moment, every dollar I'd paid alone. Suddenly, it all mattered. When I walked into my new office later that afternoon and saw Alice Newberry, partner, engraved on the glass door, I stood there staring at it for nearly 5 minutes. Not because I needed proof, because 18-year-old Alice would never have believed she'd actually make it. That evening, despite everything that had happened between us, I called my parents. A small part of me, the same hopeful daughter who once ran into the kitchen waving an acceptance letter, still wanted them to say they were proud. Mom answered, "Hi, sweetheart. I've got some amazing news." "Oh?" she replied distractedly. "I just made partner." Silence. Then, "Oh, that's nice." That's nice. Not incredible. Not congratulations. Not we're proud of you. Just, that's nice. Before I could say another word, she sighed. "Listen, Ethan's dealing with something difficult right now, so your father and I really have to go." The call ended less than 2 minutes later. I stared at my phone, then quietly placed it back into my purse. For the first time in years, I realized I had finally surpassed every expectation they had ever placed on Ethan. And somehow, it still wasn't enough. 3 days later, my phone lit up with a message from my younger brother. "Can we talk? I really need your help." I stared at Ethan's text for almost a full minute before replying. "Sure." He called less than 30 seconds later. His voice sounded different, not confident, not polished, not like the golden child I'd grown up watching everyone admire. It sounded defeated. "Hey, Alice. What's going on?" He hesitated, then finally said the words I never imagined hearing. "I'm in serious financial trouble." I leaned back in my office chair. "What kind of trouble?" "A lot." "Be specific." Another long silence. "I need to ask you for money." For one brief, completely involuntary moment, I laughed. Not because it was funny, because life had an unbelievable sense of irony. "You need money? From me?" "I know how it sounds." "No," I replied calmly. "I don't think you do." He took a deep breath. "I've got credit card debt, student loans, and I've been between jobs longer than I expected." "I thought everything was going great." "So did Mom and Dad." "What happened?" "I left the nonprofit." "When?" "About 3 years ago." 3 years. 3 entire years. Yet every conversation with my parents had painted Ethan as some wildly successful professional, changing the world. "You never mentioned that." "I didn't want people worrying." I almost smiled. No, he didn't want people knowing. "What do you need?" I asked. "I was hoping," he swallowed, "maybe you could loan me $30,000. 30,000. The number echoed inside my head. Almost exactly what my parents had taken from my college fund. The same money they had insisted would change Ethan's future forever. I slowly stood and walked toward the office window overlooking downtown Chicago. You know what's interesting? What? The amount. My college fund. He became very quiet. You remember. I never forgot. Alice. You went to Columbia because my future became your opportunity. That wasn't my decision. No, I agreed. It was Mom and Dad's. I was 17. And yet you accepted every dollar. I didn't understand. You understand now. Silence. Finally, I guess I do. I waited. He didn't apologize, not really. Instead, he said softly, I worked hard too. So did I. My voice remained calm. I worked 25 hours a week while taking classes. I graduated $80,000 in debt. I skipped meals. I missed birthdays. I watched Mom and Dad spend thousands celebrating you while they mailed me a generic congratulations card. I know. No. I shook my head even though he couldn't see me. You know now. Back then, you never asked. I didn't realize. Exactly. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, Ethan said, I'm not asking you to fix my whole life. I just need help getting back on my feet. I looked at the framed partnership certificate hanging beside my desk. Every sleepless night, every sacrifice, every rejection, every victory, none of it had been given to me. I can't. His breathing changed. You won't. No. I won't. Alice. You had every advantage. Our parents believed in you. They invested in you. They celebrated you. They rescued you. I had loans. I had grocery store shifts. I had ramen. I had nobody. You have money now. I earned it. I'll pay you back. Maybe. But that's not the point. His voice cracked. So you're really just going to let me drown? I closed my eyes. The answer came easier than I expected. I'm going to let you do exactly what I had to do. Get another job. Cut your spending. Build your life one paycheck at a time. It builds character. He recognized the phrase immediately. Dad used to say that. Yes. He said it to me while giving you my future. The call ended shortly afterward. He never actually said goodbye. 10 minutes later, Mom called. I already knew why. How could you refuse your brother? She didn't even pretend to ask how I was. He needs $30,000. He's family. So was I. This is different. No. It's exactly the same. You survived. I barely survived. But you did. Because I had no choice. You have a choice now. So did you. Silence. Then Dad called. Then my aunt. Then 2 cousins. Apparently, everyone had an opinion about what I should do with my money. Not one of them had an opinion 18 years earlier when my college fund disappeared. For 3 straight days, my phone barely stopped ringing. Finally, I sent one message to the family group chat. I am not changing my decision. Please stop asking. If this continues, I'll block every number. Dad answered almost immediately. We're only trying to save your brother. I typed back. You already chose which child to save 18 years ago. I'm simply living with the consequences of that decision. Nobody replied. Late that evening, Ethan sent me one last message. It wasn't asking for money. It wasn't trying to guilt me. It simply read, I'm sorry. I should have understood years ago what they did to you. I can't change the past, but I'm sorry I benefited from it without ever questioning it. I read it 3 times. It was the first genuine apology anyone in my family had ever offered. Part of me wanted to answer. Another part remembered every lonely night in college, every graduation photo without parents, every ignored achievement, every time I had been told I would be fine. So I archived the message. Not deleted, not answered, just archived. 3 weeks passed. The phone calls stopped. My parents eventually co-signed a debt consolidation loan for Ethan and invited him to move back home. Exactly as I expected, nothing had changed. Except me. One evening, Daniel and I celebrated my partnership at a quiet steakhouse overlooking the river. He raised his glass. To the woman who built everything herself. I smiled. For a long time, I admitted, I thought success would finally make my parents proud. And now? I looked through the restaurant window at the city lights reflecting across the water. Now I think I'm finally proud of myself. Daniel reached across the table and squeezed my hand. That simple gesture meant more than every forced compliment my parents had ever given me. The following morning, another message arrived from Ethan. I got a weekend job in retail. It's humbling. Maybe Dad was right. Character really is built this way. This time, I smiled. Not because he was suffering, because for the first time in his life, he was finally walking the road I'd traveled alone. Potential had opened doors for him, but effort would be the only thing capable of keeping them open. As for me, I finally understood something I'd spent 15 years trying to prove. My parents had invested in potential. I invested in perseverance. They believed success could be predicted. I proved it had to be earned. And that's why, when I unlock my office every morning and see my name etched into that glass door, I don't think about the college fund anymore. I think about the exhausted 18-year-old girl who refused to quit. She never had anyone betting on her, so she learned to bet on herself.